Art Matters is a series that Raza Foundation has been running and organizing for the last 58 editions. This is the 59th edition. I think the first one that's happening in Bombay, in Mumbai. Old Bombay, I prefer calling it Bombay. But speaking of the event itself, our focus really has been to sort of see how we could work with the theme that Art Matters works with, which is largely getting curators, artists from different genres to come and have a conversation. So we sort of try to connect that here with one of the key themes of the exhibition on abstraction, and how do artists, curators, poets, musicians look at abstraction in their various genres of expertise. That's pretty much what's the basis of this particular discussion this evening. We have with us in the discussion Neela Bhagwat and Ranjjit Hoskote. And this session is moderated by Ashok Vajpayee ji and Vaishnavi Ramanathan. And we have Mukta accompanying Neela ji on the tabla. Just a little bit about the artists and the moderators before we begin. Neela Bhagwat is a master of the Gwalior style of singing. She built a career on setting the words of medieval Indian poets, including Kabir, Shajo, and Meera, to intricate raga-like melodies. The result was described by Dhadkan.com as possessing the pristine beauty of tradition and refreshing breeze of modernity. Neela ji has studied with gurus like Pandit Sharat Chandra Arolkar and Pandit Jal Balapauriya. She initially focused on India's classical repertoire. The shock of the communal riots in '92 inspired her to begin singing Kabir bhajans. Her subsequent albums have included Colors of Khayal in 1994, Kabir 1 in '96, and Kabir 2 in '98. Neela ji has also collaborated with the British pianist and composer Camilla Kenkintata to record an album, Meeting Point, in 2000. She's also learned Kathak under Lachu Maharaj ji and has performed in theatre with Satyadev Dubey. She holds a master's in Marathi and Sanskrit literature and sociology. We have Ranjjit Hoskote also with us. He's a leading Anglophone Indian poet and has also been acclaimed as a seminal contributor to Indian art criticism. His collections of poetry include Vanishing Acts, New and Selected Poems, 1985 to 2005, Central Time, and most recently, Jona Wale, which was just Whale. Is it Whale? I was very like, Wale, Whale. Was published just recently in 2018. His poems have appeared in German translation, and his translation of the 14th century Kashmiri mystic Lalded has been published as I, Lalla, the Poems of Lalded. Ranjit was a fellow of the International Writing Program, University of Iowa, and has been writer in residence at Villa Volpetta in Munich, Theater de Welt, Essen Mulheim, and the Polish Institute in Berlin. He has been a researcher in residence at Basis für Aktuelle Kunst, Utrecht. He has been honored with the Sahitya Akademi Golden Jubilee Award, the Sahitya Akademi Award for Translation, and the S.H. Raza Award for Literature. Ranjit was a juror for international literature for the 2015 to 17 fellowship cycle at Academy Scholz Solitude, Stuttgart, and served on the jury of the Venice Biennale in 2015. We also, of course, have Ashok ji, the eminent Ashok Vajpayee, Indian poet, Hindi poet, essayist, literary cultural critic. Apart from being a noted cultural and arts administrator and a former civil servant, he was the chairman of the Lalit Kala Academy and has published over 23 books of poetry, criticism, and art. He was awarded the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1994 for his poetry collections. And more recently, he's been the chief trustee of the Raza Foundation, has been leading the charge of keeping Raza's ideas and his wishes alive in various forms. In fact, just yesterday he was in Mandala. As most of you know, yesterday was Raza's second death anniversary. So he was at Mandala yesterday organizing a program, which is also the reason why we're having this program today here with him. Joining us this evening also is Vaishnavi Ramanathan. Some of you have taken the guided walkthrough. She's the co-curator of the exhibition and an arts researcher, an art historian. She is with the Piramal Museum of Art. She has curated several shows on contemporary Indian artists and has written for important art magazines. She's also a guest lecturer at the Government College of Fine Arts, Chennai. Thank you so much once again for being here, all of you, and thank you, Mukta, for joining us as well. Over to you all.
We are very happy in Raza Foundation that finally Art Matters is happening in Mumbai. After all, Bombay was a very crucial space in Raza's itinerary, and he was here for many years. He was one of the founders of the Progressive Artists Group Association. What was it called? Group Association. Yeah. And from here he went to France, where he lived for 60 years. And he never forgot his hard, difficult days, both when he was in Madhya Pradesh and later in Bombay. There was a time when he had an arrangement with a taxi driver who used to work through the night. So Raza could sleep in that chawl. And in the morning when he came, Raza left, and he used to work in a block-making company. One day when Raza returned in the evening to the chawl, he was told that the taxi driver has been involved in a murder, and you better run away because you can also be implicated. So he had no place to sit. So he came back to the office, and the owners allowed him to sleep on the table on which he used to work through the day. So these were the hard days which he remembered. So when he got a little money and some fame, he started wondering that I should do something for others. So that's how the idea of Raza Foundation was born. He would not allow me to call it Raza Foundation. I had 3 quarrelsome evenings with him because he would say that I'm giving the money and I call it after myself. That's very selfish. So I used to give him a ridiculous example that Ram Pyari Dharmshala. Now Ram Pyari has given the money, so the Dharmshala is named after him. I also tried to argue with him that you are an iconic figure. If we have your name with the foundation, it'll get a brand immediately. But if we call it Foundation for Promotion of Arts and Literature and such like, it won't. On the 3rd evening, I think more under the influence of liquor and partly under my pressure, he signed the papers. But anyway, that was a long story. After 60 years in France, he returned, and we then started reactivating Raza Foundation. And as one of the things that we did in collaboration with the India International Center was to start a series of discussions, dialogues, conversations with artists. Artists, poets, filmmakers, theatre men, musicians, dancers, academics, etc. The idea was that we should have a forum where these people who belong to their own disciplines and have become rather isolated from each other should come together. So we have already been doing it for about 6 years now. We are running in the 6th year. And we have been trying for a long while that art masses should start in other cities. In Pune, we succeeded in having Rohini Bhate dialogues, which is again a multidisciplinary thing, music, dance, getting a little prominence, but visual arts, literature, etc. Something happened in Patna, something has happened in Kolkata, and something soon is going to happen in Dehradun and in Guwahati. So we are on the move, and today, welcome all of you to this collaborative exercise that we started here. Abstraction is itself a very abstract word in the sense that it is both understood differently and misunderstood also differently. All kinds of people attach all kinds of meanings to it. One of the things one would say about abstract is something which is incomprehensible, something which has no meaning. So from this end of having no meaning, you go to the other end where almost every meaning can be assigned to it. It can mean anything that you want, etc. Apart from that, the tendency to abstract is one of the basic human tendencies. Homo sapiens are different from birds and other forms of animal, that they can abstract. So that's how mathematics is born. That's how perhaps music is born. And music is supposed to be not about anything else. It is about itself. It is the total abstraction. Of course, these days the politics can also be thought to have become music in that ridiculous sense, in the sense it is no longer about anything else. It is about itself. But I remember an episode which is very interesting. Amba Das is one of the most abstract painters we ever had. And Gyani Zail Singh, as the President of India, happened to visit Bharat Bhavan. And to our ill luck, the first painting he encountered was that of Amba Das. And all of us were in attendance, which included, importantly, J. Swaminathan, the great painter who was our director of Rupankar Museum. And Gyani Zail Singh looked at it, and it has to be narrated in Hindi, because this conversation took place in Hindi. All the punch is in Hindi. And he said, "Bhai, director साहब, ये कुछ समझ नहीं आती. ये बात खेत की कर रही है कि खलिहान की?" स्वामीनाथन सेठ कि राष्ट्रपति जी, ये किसी के बारे में नहीं है, ये खुद है. बोले, बात आपने बड़ी दूरदर्शी की कही, लेकिन समझ तो आनी चाहिए. अब ये समझ तो आनी चाहिए was the idiom of the visit. We had a governor who was from Haryana, and he never liked all this art. But he was never able to say it, because Indira Gandhi came and praised it very high. Vice President came and praised it very high. So he used to keep quiet. But when Gyani Zail Singh, so he thought he'll have his day now and say. Anyway, the painting. In the meantime, the team moved towards a painting of Swaminathan. And this, for some odd reason, that governor liked. And he pulled the, Gyani ji, ye dekhiye. And Gyani ji also liked it. Haan, ye to samajh aati hai. So Swaminathan, not to miss, he says, Rashtrapati ji, manai to maine hai, पर मेरी समझ में तो आज तक नहीं आई. So that was another. So that's how it went on. So all kinds of people have all kinds of ideas. There was a Chief Minister of Gujarat, Madhav Singh Solanki. He once came and he also saw something. By that time, I was cheesed off by explaining to many people abstract works. So I asked him, "Sir, do you like music?" He said, "Huh." I said, "Vocal or instrumental?" "Vocal." "Who's your favorite musician?" "Bhimsen Joshi." All very predictable. Now I can see him walking straight into my trap. So I told him, "Sir, you must have heard his, those days were long playing record days. Na? So you must have heard Rag Malkos by Bhimsen Joshi, Pagalagan De." I must have heard it 20 times. Then I said, "Sir, what is Rag Malkos about?" "About? What do you mean by that?" I said, "Sir, you have heard Rag Malkos sung by Pandit Bhimsen Joshi for 10 hours. Because 33 minutes. So I am asking you, what is the meaning of Rag Malkos?" He said, "But why are you asking me that?" "You stood before a painting for half a minute and you wanted to know the meaning of it. And you have heard Rag Malkos for 10 hours and I am asking you what is the meaning." He kept quiet. But then we became good friends, After that, he used to ring me up and I said, never thought of this. Anyway, so the point is, abstraction is a phenomena which one can see from the beginning of humanity, in a sense, and certainly from the beginning of the arts, in one way or the other. But somehow our both visual and other kinds of faculties have become very glued to the narrative, to the story. So the moment you go to a painting and you see a goat or a woman or a tree, actually you stop seeing. Because you are seeing tree now, you're seeing the woman now, you forget about the color combinations, what is happening between colors, etc., etc. So you get away very fast without seeing properly. Most of us are not seeing, we are only noticing in the passing. Similarly in music, and there are all kinds of interesting contradictions one can talk about. I'll not, because you have to listen to these people, not to me. One of them is this Saguna Nirguna, for instance. Nirguna. But Nirguna has to be sung in language. Language is Saguna. So there is a very interesting contradiction there, that even Nirguna has to be evoked through Saguna. Similarly, I think abstract and non-abstract are not such binaries. One is evoking the other, and one in some sense subsumes the other, or provokes the other, or resonates the other. So let us start maybe with Ranjjit Hoskote, because you are both a poet and an art critic. Tell us, what do you think is the relationship, if any, between, for instance, poetry and painting in terms of abstraction? What is it that they share, if they do? And if they don't share, they don't share. They are not obliged to share. But I suspect they do.
Thank you, Ashokji. I was actually hoping to sit down quietly and listen to Neela talk about abstraction music as a kind of opening statement, but you've put me on the spot here. So I thought one of the ways in which I'd look at this comparison between painting or the visual arts and poetry would be to see if we can think about both these arts as essentially artisanal activity. Because for me, that's a useful way of approaching these questions. Because too often, when we're thinking about the arts, we tend to emphasize inspiration, vision, ideas, the affective, things that are essentially quite imponderable. But as any of us who work in any of the arts know, ultimately it's a very visceral activity. It's something that you do with things. And that thingness of the arts is what I would like to talk about here. I think, let's just talk about painting. I think all painters work with paradox. Because on the one hand, they have to work with materiality, with pigments, with the surface, with their brushes or palette knives, or whatever media they use. All that is material. It commits them to something that is matter, that's dirty, that's raw. But they're using all of these things to direct our attention as viewers to something that is beyond, something that they conjure into being. So that's a paradox that painters simply have to work with. So if we are talking about abstraction in that context, I think abstraction is present in all forms of painting. So abstraction I would characterize more as a ratio or a presence, sometimes a very elusive presence in painting. In poetry, I think it's, as you well know, Ashokji, it's a very different set of issues that we're looking at. But we're also working with material, whether it's assonance or resonance or rhyme or the length and quantity of vowels, patterns of consonants, and what it is we're doing with musicality and image. All of these are also very palpable and visceral things. And we're raising to mind that which is beyond these words. So I think it's that surplus which is what we're talking about when we think of abstraction. My problem with the word abstraction is that it always seems to be founded on some kind of lack. So whenever I'm thinking of abstraction, and I've now thought about it for a number of years, in fact, the very first show I ever curated in 1993 was called Hinged by Light. It brought together 3 abstractionists and what they were doing with their practice. But I think we use that word, and with it comes a baggage of negative definition. We talk of the non-objective, the non-figurative. And I'm wondering if there's a way in which we can speak about abstraction in a way that emphasizes what it does instead of what it doesn't do. So that's something I'd like to put into play at this point.
Yes. Thank you, Ashokji, Vaishnavi, Rashmi, and the team. In music, we have the rag and the tal, which we can say they are abstract. And the poem that is sung is about some experience, about some interpretation. So it is words primarily. But if we say that ragas are completely abstract, I am not giving the ragas their due, because they do express a lot. We thought of Malgaons, for example. If I am singing now if I sing sa ga ma pa ni sa, it's different. If I use the komal sur, or in English they say flat note, which really doesn't mean anything in Indian music, because we also have a tivra madhyam. So we prefer to say shuddha, komal and tivra. So the komal notes have their own statement to make. The shuddha surs have their own statement to make. The combinations are several, and they also mean a lot. And in fact, it is the word, and it is the impact of those komal, shuddha and tivra notes on the mind of the composer that try to define the rag set in a particular tal. Tal, again, they are waves. They are sound waves. They are not like 1, 2, 3. They are not like that. They are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9. We leave things in between. And we relate the silence and the sound. So it's the silence which enhances the sound, and it's the sound which tries to understand the silence. So the other one wants to understand the other. And there is a synthesis of both of them, maybe, which is a composition and creation. So abstract is also concrete, and concrete also needs abstraction, because if I sing pa ga la, say la is a longer vowel, pa ga shorter vowels, la gana short vowels. So I have to think of la gana. If I elongate ga, it's not that melodious. If I elaborate a, e, o, u, they are more longer vowels, and they are elaborated in the alap. So even the concrete has an abstract side to it. And then the concrete, of course, defines what we feel. Pagalaganade is a definition of, let me touch your feet. Instead of saying, let me, Pagalaganade. So this is, if I say it in music, it's more beautiful. Touching the feet is not as mundane as that. It is more aesthetically enjoyable. So that is what is said in that bandish. And that poem, primarily it's a Meera bhajan, I think. So Saint Meerabai spoke like that. And we singers, we sing the devotionals quite a lot because music demands devotion. If I have to be in tune, I have to be devoted to it. If I don't concentrate, I will be out of tune. Then there is no point in singing. And therefore, we close the eyes. But I must say that this practice of closing the eyes, perhaps, if I'm right, has begun by Pandit Ravi Shankar. And earlier than that, my guru, who was actually contemporary of Ravi Shankar, but he grew in a very strict discipline, and he said, "Dole banda karu naka." He would say, don't close your eyes. You have to be alert and still looking at the audience. And you still have to be introverted. Oh, it's so difficult. I used to feel. And then he didn't like my closing the eyes, but in front of him, I kept them open. And when I was just by myself, I closed the eyes and concentrated. I thought this practice is a little modern practice. The introvertedness is acknowledged. The inner self, which is involved in music, is acknowledged in the modern days. Earlier, I think they must be practicing since the age of 6 or 7, or it was a part of their system, and they could look at anything and be in tune. For us, it is difficult. It's really, I'm being very honest and frank with you that I began concentrating on music very late. It was Ashokji who really gave me a platform in Bharat Bhavan at the age of 41. So in our times, we have to concentrate. And I think Pandit Ravi Shankar also realized it, being surrounded by the Europeans and Americans. He realized that if he looks at them, they won't give any feedback. So he must concentrate and look at himself and play. So it could be many other situations in which one has to concentrate. But that is abstraction also. To be with oneself and be in tune with the abstract rag, which evokes something, some feeling, some sensuous feeling, something which you can't always describe, but it evokes something. And that is the communicative aspect of abstract rag and tal. Tal, I'm sure Mukta can show you the waves if we have the time. But concrete also is necessary, as I always feel. This is the x-axis, this is the y-axis, this is the time axis, this is the space axis, and temporal also relates to history. And if we have to touch upon the history, when I sing, I touch the sensibility of the 15th century or 16th or 17th century, and then I'm in the 21st century. So I have to bring them together. And then there is also another problem, taking the same great idiom of expression to the younger generation. The younger generation doesn't look at it the same way. I never suspected the existence of Krishna. But I could easily sing Dekho Sakhi Kanhaiya Roke Thado Hai Gaile. Fine, musical design is beautiful. But a young student of mine, 21-year-old, he said, Neela ji, please don't teach me those domestic violence bandishis. I never thought there is domestic violence in it. But I thought maybe he's right. Because in most of the bandishis, Krishna is teasing and harassing somebody, and the girl is saying, Are Baba, nako, let me be by myself. So that whole thing is like domestic violence. If we put it in today's houses and homes and relationships, it is something like that. So as you go ahead in times, in history, the contemporary content is different. And we have to pay attention to that. That is the concrete in music, which as a music teacher, I've been teaching since last 44 years. And I have to pay attention to my young students who cannot take something which is, it doesn't appeal to their senses. Then I said, yes, you have to make your own compositions. And then they do it. They must do it because contemporary life has changed. Another point which, if you allow me to say, give me a little time, I feel personally that the musical resonance in a culture is like the subconscious layers of a culture. And in history, a period comes in which those subconscious layers have changed. My life is not the same as my mother's. And my child's life is still more different. And a girl who is singing in maybe later part of 21st century will still feel something different. And that flow of episodes and history and events and changes in the subconscious layers of cultures, we have to take into account, and then we have to relate to that. That is the concrete. That is the different interpretation of the abstract rag and tal.
It was a very cold evening, and he came, and he was a very काफी लहीम शहीम थे, शेरवानी वो लगाए हुए टोपी, and he sang for 2.5 hours. And for the first time, I saw a musician who opened his eyes, I think twice or thrice, and that too gave a feeling कि अच्छा आप भी बैठे हैं, कोई हर्ज नहीं. He allowed you to listen to his music, but his music was addressed to himself. So that is one. Other thing which emerges from what Ranjit was saying. You see, abstraction also evokes plurality of meanings and also ambiguities of meanings. Now, these are not necessarily negative qualities. I mean, it can create a plurality of meanings as you interpret it. Similarly, the Rag Malkos, supposing Rag Malkos is an abstract idea of it, and it can be evoked in many different ways, but it's also ambiguity. The notion that something is fixed and certain seemed to be either denied or bypassed or assaulted by the abstract. That it is not so. Why should there be a fixed meaning? So say that we can interpret a work of art, whether it is abstract or non-abstract, in different ways. But in some ways, the abstract does it more than the non-abstract. Would you?
Absolutely. And speaking of ambiguity and abstraction, there are some languages where the grammar actually allows this. For instance, in Urdu, there's the technique of izafat, where you use a conjunction like of to produce a sequence of terms that are connected in ways that are not always clear. It's from one of Meer's poems, where there's a certain kind of bird which is evoked. And it's to the effect of Ashya, e per, e rang, e parida. So when you link all those words together, you're not quite sure whether it's the nest of a bird whose color has flown, or it's a colorful bird that has flown. Is it the bird or the colors? And as you dwell on these ambiguities, you actually arrive at a completely different inflection of what's being talked about. So there seems to be an ostensible subject to the line, but how it gets parsed gives you a completely different sense of what is being evoked there. So, I mean, in Urdu, for instance, Mani Afirini is the basis of how you become a connoisseur of poetry. The more the ambiguity, the more the play with meaning, the deeper and richer the experience of that poem. Now, other languages might not allow that to the same extent, but I think it's wise for us to acknowledge that ambiguity needs to be embraced in a certain way. But it also sets me thinking that maybe in the visual arts, particularly in India, some of these discussions don't even feature, because at some point we've lost our, for one there's a kind of narrowness to the way in which the arts have gone. They've tended to be cut off from one another. And I mean, for instance, I was heartened to hear, Neela, when you said that for you, abstraction in a certain kind of classical Hindustani music allows for communication. And it's true. It touches on a certain shared subconscious set of resonances. In the visual arts, almost the opposite is true. Abstraction is almost a definite way to lock yourself off from communication. You know, it's, as you said when you began, and that is, it's a non-simple thing. It's absolutely the case that you're not even sure what this language is. What is this pictorial language? And where it comes towards something you seem to understand, like the entire stream within Indian modernism that's sometimes called Neo-Tantra, that falls into another kind of set of problems. I mean, is it actually related to spiritual practice, or is it eventually just a simple set of geometrical moves? How do you embrace, understand, and interpret these things? So one of the questions that's haunted me as a poet and as someone who's written about the arts is that we are constantly closing doors on histories that we inherit, and that actually should be part of how we look at these things. For instance, when we think of abstraction in the Indian visual arts, we're relying on things that happened among the avant-gardes of the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s in Europe. Or then we think of the School of New York. And both those are valid starting points. But if we don't revise how our sense of how our minds work, if we don't recover other kinds of vocabularies, something that's possessed me for a long time, for instance, is the word rang, the concept rang. Go back to Braj or Avadhi or to the work of Amir Khosrow, rang turns out to be not simply color, but also passion, depth of feeling, a bridge towards the infinite. If you try and apply it today in an Indian visual arts context, you might actually, this term might give you a purchase for processes that are happening, but that you can't name in the sort of Western modernist vocabulary that you have.
You mentioned the work of the Kashmiri, the tantric artists. Yeah. So you were saying that their approach, like an artist like G.R. Santosh, for example, has a very different approach to his art compared to the other Indian abstractionists who were looking at not this, like Neti Neti, the Advaitic kind of an approach. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Let me talk a little bit about Santosh first. I think he was one of the few painters working in a modernist idiom who really felt he could wager his life on the kind of spiritual practice from which his art emerged. I think that's unusual because in modernism, for whatever reason, there tends to be a certain distinction between the art you produce and the kind of life you lead. There's every attempt to reconcile these, but then the art has a reality of its own. I think with Santosh, and this might have been his private quest, the art genuinely came from his firm commitment to Trika, or to Kashmir Shaivism, and he also practiced some of these spiritual practices. So he was altogether a slightly unusual kind of figure. What that does to our reception of his paintings still remains an open question. And I think that has something to do with the way in which we come to art. How do we consume it? How does it become available to us? It is, for us as contemporary viewers, not part of a larger, if ever there was a larger social whole, in which it also was connected to spiritual strivings, for instance. And I think of a very late essay of Anand Kumaraswamy's, Why Exhibit Works of Art. Some of you might be familiar with this, where he essentially makes the claim that museums should be places where you look at art objects, not for their own sake, but to understand the spiritual quests to which they were related. I think that's an extreme example of what museums are for. But it leads us to think about this. If you come to Santosh from some sense of Trika or Kashmir Shaivism, then you see in his work striving for some larger totality, which is based on a central trope in Kashmir Shaivism, which is Patyavidya. The recognition of your identity with the play of the universe. Yeah? So it's a affirmative kind of understanding of totality. But if you come to it as a viewer who knows nothing of this, what you see are beautiful pictures, literally. And they might work as such. But do you get the depth and intensity of what the intention of the artist was? I think there's a missing term in this equation is probably some notion of pedagogy, some notion of education. And this is true not only for abstraction, but all forms of the visual arts. I'm not saying there's any single way of understanding what artists produce, but I suspect there's a gap or a gulf that separates viewers from producers, which might lead us to these kinds of situations. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I think in the case of abstract art, that's more so because of the kind of content that is there in the arts itself. And when we look at abstraction and the history of it, abstract expressionism, for example, was used by the state machinery in the US to suppress a certain kind of art that was not very comfortable to talk about. So what would you think of as the relationship between Indian abstract art and the institution?
Also, when we speak about how American abstract expressionism became part of the State Department's, if you will, official culture, I think in recent decades, maybe for the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a tendency to play up how this kind of art became amenable to American foreign policy. But I don't think this, we should, as a caution to ourselves, I don't think this should take away from the actual quests of Rothko, Motherwell, Clifford Still, Barnett Newman. Those were all highly individual, distinctive practices. It so happened that they became amenable to an official culture, which wanted to spread this notion of the American art scenario across the world in the time of the Cold War. I don't think there's a clear parallel in India. I don't think abstraction was ever in any great danger of becoming the official style for Indian art. I think to the extent that we've ever had any kind of serious policy towards this, I would highlight occasions like the festivals of India, or an exhibition like India, Myth and Reality, or various of the occasional initiatives that the government has put out. The emphasis has been on a kind of inclusiveness. To give the government credit, Ashokji's not going to give me plus points for saying this, there has been an attempt to cover all of the strategies of art and to present them in a certain way. I don't think if there's anything that haunts the Indian establishment, or haunted it up to, say, 5 years ago, I think it was the question of wrestling with the Indic past and how to represent that, and how to retain some kind of purchase on modernity. I think the international exhibitions of the early 1980s, including India, Myth and Reality, really tried to address that question. But at no point has any single style been privileged in any way. And I think abstraction would resist it. Because, are you going to say something, Neela, about this?
Yes, I have been listening to the current classical music, and in music, I think it's the other way around, because the abstract is uplifted and promoted by the state, by the establishment, and they find it good because it doesn't touch the social reality, the psychological reality. In no way the changes are reflected in it. So you just sing in tune, you arrive at the song, the first beat of the tal, and you sing first dance, and you are a great singer. You don't have to make a single statement. And that is, I feel, quite sad, because then that's a uh, technical perfection that the artists strive for. And that abstraction is uplifted in a great way. And that is something to worry about, I feel. And therefore, I encourage my students always to compose your own bandishes and say something that you feel like. Let us see how to compose and how to use the content to make it evocative. In what kind of words? For example, the idea of death is very difficult to express in music, because in this bandish, Kabhi Tanahaiyon mein यूं ही हमारी याद आएगी, I like that song, and I tried to set it to tune in Rag Malkaus in Tal Tilwada. And my friend Praful Bidwai said, Neela, this न फिर तू जी सकेगा और न तुझको मौत आएगी it's not music. You change it. Change those words. You cannot meditate on mouth in this way. And raag ho jayegi, you cannot meditate on. So music demands something to meditate on. And that is very positive. That's all positive energies, I think. That you see the finality of a thing, and yet you cannot talk about it in such mundane terms. Music goes higher than the mundane, I feel. It's a magical language. It's a marvelous language. And our musicians are great and marvelous in their creation. That's why a person like me who has tried to understand the traditional idiom, I feel I have to absorb it, internalize it, and then I can't sit quiet and keep quiet. I have to make my own bandish. And, well, I started doing it. And I must say that this kind of encouragement has been given by Kumar Gandharv, because he made his own bandishes, his own interpretations of established ragas. Earlier than that, people used to make bandishes within their universe. There was Krishna, there was Shiva, there was Rama, there was this, that, and they were gods and goddesses. Here I felt, well, there is life experience, and I can talk about it. And that was a great inspiration. And I feel that music needs to define and use a concrete word. Otherwise, abstract is very easy to digest and say, oh, बहुत अच्छा है, क्या बात है. You can always say that. क्योंकि बहुत फास्ट तान आती है, कितना रियाज किया होगा, अरे बाप रे, क्या काम, क्या कमाल की बात है. All this कमाल की बात is just, sit in one place and go on doing riyaz. And don't think, don't relate to people, don't relate to life. I feel our life is very, very, it's full of conflicts. It's a tumultuous life. There is so much negative in society around, and therefore within ourselves, that we have to talk about it in a different way. I feel it like that. Abstract music is very easy to uplift. वही हो रहा है अभी तो. Yes.
Now that you've raised this question, It's true. I think it has to do with something that I touched on very briefly earlier, which is how we consume the arts. There's a kind of, if you will, a culture of the virtuoso, which emphasizes what you've just talked about. In the words of a fellow critic of mine from the Times of India of long ago, the concert was characterized by express thorns, he used to say. He had this peculiar vocabulary, and it was all about speed and athleticism in concerts. So, in a sense, that is what I probably stepping on everybody's corns here. But this is what characterizes the art market, the market for the so-called, we keep using this absurd terminology, modern and contemporary, not quite sure where the line between the two is. But if you look at what kind of art seems to travel beyond our frontiers, what gets played up, whether at auction or in museum contexts, it's a very particular kind of abstraction. It's not that I have anything against these particular artists. I love their work. But it is Nasreen, it's Gaitonde, and now it is the sainted Ganesh Haloi, who's been shown in the most recent edition of the Documenta. So it appears that abstraction travels out of India because, for whatever reason, it's seen as universal, which is always a loaded word, which partly means that the key urgencies that artists are dealing with here in other forms don't get reflected. They don't seem to travel. And you then have a particular and somewhat static interpretation of what goes on in Indian art. So again, I would say that in this light, abstraction tends to not have a very productive presence. It's not because of what's in the painting or what the artist tried to do. It's how it's instrumentalized by a system of consumption, by a certain kind of global art situation, if you will. So that speaks to some of the things you said. But one more thing that I'd maybe draw you out on, Neela. You were talking about how you need to create new bandishes to reflect contemporary realities. But I was just thinking, and there's something that has haunted me for a long time. When you go to, say, the Thumris, when you look at the bandishes, they're all saturated in the violence of the Gangetic Plains and how women suffered that. It's about, if you read some of these, if you look at the bandish lines, they speak of indenture, of forced labor, of migration. And I keep these words haunt me. Sayan ko le gaye thanedar. How did the thanedar show up in a Thumri? It has to do with the way in which corvée labor was exacted in the northern plains. So many of these crises are there in the music.
Kal kahan the kanhai jahan sari rain bitai. Ye bhi hai uske.
That's true, but when we consume these Thumris, we're not aware of what has gone into it. Your student discovered domestic violence in some of the Ras Leela. But there's all kinds of violence in the texts, which could be revealed, could be demonstrated by pedagogy when you're teaching, for instance. So I don't know if you've had those occasions.
Somehow there is not that obvious violence in the bandishes. There are very few bandishes I have come across in the traditional repertoire where there is that obvious reference to the violence. But otherwise, there is a lot of sanchari bhava, as we would call it. There is one basic emotion and basic sensibility, if I may say so. But around that, there is a lot of emotional memory. And that emotional memory, which an actor also has to draw upon. That emotional memory comes into play when I sing a Thumri like Kal Kahan The Kanhai or Bhig Gayi Mori Sari. All that, it's okay. It doesn't matter to me. Thumris are still more palpable, more adjustable. But the Chota Khayal, as we call it, are more mundane and more. They say the same thing all through. They don't have much to say. My young students say, oh, but we did that bandish in China in which the same thing was happening. Why is that so? So I have to deal with this young generation of 8 years. They want to learn music. They are very much interested in learning. And I have to give them something. Then I have to think of something about, say, the light, rain, Surya, Chandra, and all these things, and make small, simple compositions which they will relate to. And that is really, it is great need of the hour, I would say. For the young generation, you have to give them something which they can relate to. And for the youngsters, the Sanchari Bhava doesn't exist. It's only when you experience life, the Sanchari comes into play. For me, it is fine. But for a girl of 8 or a boy of even 20, it's not fine. So this is something which is a problem in music, which I try to solve and make new compositions and get them to make their own compositions also.
Are they making such new compositions?
They do.
And yeah. Do you think that these compositions reflect their reality?
It does. It does.
I have not heard them like that.
Because, again, there's no market for it. There's no market, and I must say that next week, Bangalore Poetry Festival has invited me to sing my own feminist and kind of progressive compositions, which I think in the last 50 years I have not come across. All my feminist friends say, you teach us your bandish, we want to hear your bandishes. But the establishment has never taken any notice of it. It's now that this is happening, I was quite happy. Oh, देर हुआ लेकिन अंधेर तो नहीं है.
Let me point out to an interesting thing that happened a few days. There was this spontaneous campaign against growing intolerance, which was started by some writers, including me, when we returned our awards. It was joined by about 400 artists, art critics who signed huge petitions supporting us. It was also signed and supported by 500 scientists. In fact, they said taking the cue from the lead given by the writers against intolerance. But one community which remained completely silent was the musicians and the dancers. Maya Rao or somebody like that joined in but others do not. So a notion gets created that these forms, both classical music and classical dance, have abstracted themselves from the pressures of contemporary tensions and realities. And if they are expressed at all, they are expressed in their own conventional language. But I can give you an example why it can be done. Ghalib's last sher in Urdu, I don't know whether it is, but that's alleged to be. है कहाँ तमन्ना का दूसरा कदम यारब, हमने दश्ते इम्का को एक नक्शे पा पाया. Where is the second step of tamanna? Desire, very loosely translated. Now, come to think of it, here is an image being created for an abstract feeling. है कहाँ तमन्ना का दूसरा कदम यारब. So, where is the first one? Naturally. So, the first one is, हमने दश्ते इम्का को, this world of phenomena, we have found it only as a footprint. Now, images which are being used are very concrete. Qadam, footprint, the world of phenomena. But it's an abstract statement. So it is possible to allow the contemporary anguish to come in can reveal itself as contemporary without necessarily making it. There was no convention of calling tamanna as a qadam. Urdu poetry did not have that convention जिसमें तमन्ना को दूसरा कदम या पहला कदम या कोई भी कदम कहे. तो you see, it is this. Another example from Ghalib is, I forget the first line, कि जो चिरागाने दिवाली सफ बसफ जलता हूं मैं. The first line says something, whatever it says. The second line is saying, जैसे दिवाली के चिराग एक के बाद एक जलते हैं, वैसे मैं जलता हूं. अब दिवाली के चिराग जो है वो तो खुशहाली का प्रतीक है. Diwali is supposed to be a celebration of joy and all that. And this man is converting that into an image of suffering. दिवाली के चिराग जैसे एक के बाद एक जलते हैं, वैसे मैं जल रहा हूं. Now, this is what is done by making the contemporary come in. But if you continue to be, like he referred to the Thudis, with तान कप्तान वगैरह भी तो है, and things of that kind, तो उसमें ये कभी प्रकट ही नहीं होता है. This is only to provoke.
Sorry, yes. I must share a composition of mine which I did in 1986 for an All India Women's Conference. And I said Jaganaki Bhaira Bhai. But usually it is Krishna who is woken up. And I said Sahelariyan. If I say Sahelariyan, it changes the content completely. Now let me sing a little. It's in Rag Deshkar again. Deshkar is a morning rag which wakes up Krishna usually.
बक से तो गाना हमेशा अच्छा.
हाँ?
बक से तो गाना हमेशा.
थोड़ी बक भी करनी चाहिए. कनक किए मेरा भई जागन की भई सोहे जागन की भई सहावे हम सब आवे एक बेर मिलन की बेर भई मिलन की बेर भई सोहे मिलने की बेर भाई, it meant something else. We are all, it's milna. But milan is different. Milan is of the two and that typical romance we reflected on. But here it became a bandish of the conference. Milane ki bear bhai, sohelariyan, all my friends. And friends also include men. Because men have to be feminists, otherwise there is no point.
They're being men.
Yeah. So that also is there. Another bandish which I would like to share is a bandish on the experience of rape. I was doing a slideshow and a script on Ahilya, in which I interpreted what Indra did to her was a kind of rape. I'm sure the story of Ahilya is known to all of us here. Otherwise, you can go to Google and find out who is Ahilya. Because the time is very little, that's why. So I thought, I have to make a bandish on this, how to do it, and what is there at the basis of. And then I said, yes, it is unwanted touch. So let me compose something like that. Then I made it in Rag Bhairav. Teen tal. Abana sahave muriyadi, abana sahave muriyadi, man nahi mane, paras agani samdha. Agani samage abana sahave bhuli bisari aas pyas dekh dekh jiya akula abana sahave muriyadi bhuli bisari aas pyas dekh dekh jiya bulave abana sahave abana sahave abana sahave. I thought it was enough for me to say. And I sang it first to Dr. A.R. Desai, who was our professor of sociology. And he said, yes, Neela, I can see that it is on the experience of rape. Acha kiya hai tumne. So I didn't tell him anything, and I thought, well, if Dr. Desai can understand it is on this kind of experience, then okay, it's reaching out, let it go ahead. So then another experience I had, I was teaching Bhairav to a Sardar in the place Kapurthala. He learns from me on Skype. And he said, और कुछ सिखाइए, इतना भैरव में और कुछ होगा. मैंने कहा, अच्छा मैं अपनी एक बंदिश सिखाती हूँ. So I taught this to him. It's a beautiful bandish, he said. It really reaches out to men also. And I was very happy. Then he said, आप मुझे उसका notation भेज दिए, मैं वो गाना चाहता हूँ. अच्छी बात है. So I sent him the notation, and then I was very happy that people really need something new, something which is contemporary. And abstract is always there in music, especially rag and tal. We can't do without them. But you also need the touch of social reality. And that doesn't get a market, but it's okay. You make your work, and a time will come when people will need this. So you prepare a book. This is my book of my bandishes. And then I also relate a lot to painting. And I have such good friends like Nasreen and Altaf, and Sudhir is sitting somewhere here. And you relate to them, you relate to good poetry, and make a bandish out of that. you become contemporary.
Would you like to add something before we open it to the audience?
I have one thing to ask you about.
Yeah.
You curated a show on abstract art, that nothing is absolute. Could you take us through what were the arguments in the show, and what do you think is the contested relationship between abstract Indian art and philosophy?
Nothing is absolute actually began as a conversation between Melly Gobai, the abstract artist, who's a dear old friend, and me. It actually was a way of taking forward conversations and arguments we'd had for many, many years about what is it that has defined this whole family of strategies, artistic strategies that we call abstraction in India. So we thought at some point that instead of meeting and quarreling in a delightful way about this, we would just try and put it together as an exhibition and see what it looked like. So we focused on works from the Nicholson collection. That formed a kind of basis for us. This was at the CSM base, at the museum. But we also drew on a whole variety of other materials, on the occult, on magical texts, on wayside shrines, on Islamic geometry, on tiles from Sindh, from really about the 12th to 13th century. So what we tried to do there was, in brief, to expand our way of thinking about abstraction, to include not only what came to us in an academic sense, I mentioned that earlier, what we take for granted as a kind of Western art history, but also to see how abstraction might always have been part of our way of dealing with a larger reality. So we looked at the aniconic, for instance. That's a very strong indwelling element of the Indian ritual experience. Because whenever we talk about I tend to be uncomfortable about this word Indic, because it's a polite way of saying Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and not anything else, which is a simple-minded way of approaching this, because the confluences among religions that started here and religions that came from outside are so strong that you can't actually tear that weave apart. But there's a way of thinking about what the aniconic is. There are wayside shrines. It's something that precedes the murti. So we wanted to look at those starting points. We also wanted to look at cosmograms. We wanted to look at how, for instance, Jain cosmic diagrams might embrace a certain sense of totality. So it was a way of trying to move away from this killer word abstraction and to look at concepts of infinity, uncertainty, totality, cosmic wagers, and to generally see if we could look at what abstractions were doing as speculative investigations, not as, the truth from the mountaintop. So essentially that is which is why the title was a play on the idea of the belief that abstraction is somehow a road to the absolute. So we were looking at how actually there are relative abstractions, and they might approach language, interpretation, the figure, the diagram, and also move away. So it's the moving towards and the moving away. That's the shuttle that we wanted to capture.
Any questions from the audience?
Be brief, if possible, witty.
Thank you very much for a most interesting discussion on a very difficult and difficult concept. As you all were speaking, I was thinking how you would articulate the parallels and the differences between abstraction and symbolic thinking or symbolism. Leaving aside for the moment art and music, abstraction very often we think of it in philosophy and in physics and in the hard sciences. And there that process usually, as we understand it, involves sort of pairing and leaving aside specificities and cultural paraphernalia and going to a kind of, I don't want to say universal, but that is what abstraction is. symbolism comes very often in religious imagery and so on. Some of the processes are the same as in abstraction, but the symbol is, though it is an abstraction, it is an extremely culturally dense kind of a creation. So in your fields, how would you look at abstraction versus symbolic processes? That's my question to each of you. Could say something about that.
Well, I would like to speak about Chokhamera, Saint Chokhamera in this context, because for him, Vithala was there in his mind, and he was not allowed the entry in the temple of Pandharpur to see the icon. The icon existed in his mind, and he sees the abstract form of Vithala, in which he says that Chokha mhane माझा विठ्ठल सोवळा. Sovala is pure. Who is pure? What is pure? Life is not pure. It has all impurities in it. But माझा विठ्ठल सोवळा अरूपे आगळा विटेवरी. To him, there is no form of Vithala. He saw Vithala in his heart as the form, as the symbol, maybe, of purity and intensity and devotion. That is Chokhamera. So here there is abstraction and there is the image which is imagined in heart. So there is a symbol. Vithala was a symbol of unity of all castes and also religions. And he was what we today say, what is that term? I forgot. Syncretic. He was a syncretic god, maybe. And he had an image, but he existed in the minds of the devotees. And so Chokhamera, being a Mahar, he was not allowed in the temple. So he was imagining at some pure form of consciousness. So that is abstract, and yet it is about a symbol. This is what I thought of when you asked.
Vithoba is probably the god of the moment. As you were speaking, I was thinking of a line from a Tukarama, which is again a way of thinking about Vithoba, where he says, Sundarate dhyana ubhe vitevari. So I've always been fascinated by that line. How does one contemplate what is a dhyana? It's not an icon that is standing on the brick, right? Literally, it's an absorption. It is some absorption in which the worshipping self has become one with what is being worshipped, but is able to see its beauty. Beauty is what this carries. There's a kind of inclusion in that image. So to me, again, as to you, I mean, it's moments of this kind where the specificities of the symbol seem to diminish, and they take over something that is more beyond words, more visceral. And I think there's also that strain within Indian abstraction. So this exhibition that Vaishnavi referred to, Nothing is Absolute, which Melly and I curated, one of the strands in it was symbolism, precisely. How Indian artists have used certain kinds of languages of symbolism or vocabularies. And we tend to define that as abstract, but is that really what's going on there? Again, I tend to see things as being in the gap between. That space of in-betweenness is very important when we define things. So I tend to be fascinated by how you might use, as Santosh did, you use the language of Tantra, use mandalas and yantras. But at some point in the sheer making of that work, do you or do you not transcend the symbol and what it stands for and point to something beyond it? I don't think every such attempt is successful, but as viewers of art, I think we should acknowledge the struggle and the effort to do that, to work with the residual archetypal power of symbols, but to see if they can move beyond whatever religious or sectarian costume they've acquired over a period of time. So I think that tension between a, so to speak, specific or local or sectarian meaning and the universal resonances, I think that will always remain. I think it gets pointed up in certain kinds of sculpture, but in painting it's very, very prevalent. Tayyab's Mahishasuramardini also comes to mind, but that's a whole different story. But
just in response to your question, just as Ranjit said, of course, you can think of symbolic abstraction in terms of G.R. Santosh's work. And I think we also need to remember that in the visual art context, abstraction is more of an umbrella term, just as we say installation. But within installation, you have sculpture installation, video, it can be textual, oratic, and so forth. And in abstraction, you have G.R. Santosh, of course, symbolic abstraction, but you also have Ganesh Haloy, lyrical abstraction. You can have minimalism, in reference to Agnes Martin and Nasreen Mohammadi's work. Yes. But apart from that, I'd also like to just make an addendum to this discussion, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Neela spoke about the dangers of, official culture valorizing abstraction in the context of Indian classical music. And Ranjit, you alluded to the dangers of turning the language of abstraction into a language of hermeticism, where it is only decipherable to the artist or a few contemporaries of those artists. So in that context, I'd like to talk about perhaps a term that I've used elsewhere, which is the politicality of abstraction, by which I mean that there is the possibility for of artists deploying strategies of abstraction to speak to contemporary political and social realities. And as examples, I would give, three women artists. Gargi Raina, constructing the memory of a room, using abstraction, to talk about, the Gujarat genocide. Zarina Hashmi, Home is a Foreign Place, to talk about the diasporic reality and, of course, before that, partition. And Navjot, again, talking about, in the aftermath of the destruction of the Babri Masjid and the riots that followed in Bombay. So again, I mean, we have three women artists who actually use the tools and the strategies of abstraction to talk about contemporary urgencies. I mean, this is just an addendum and an observation, not a question.
Would anybody like to respond to that or add
to? Just wondering, when we talk about Shiva as a Nateshwar, one wonders, I mean, it's about the deity related towards or presiding over, let's say, the dance, or maybe attributed towards the dance art, or let's say, I wonder if it is, he's also attributed towards music. And then we often see Shiva shown with closed eyes and also reclusive often. Then again, another imagery, if you look at attributed, is Saraswati. And often we see Saraswati also, rarely I've come across Saraswati also shown in company. Generally, the imagery is always isolated in a way. So the question is that when you talk about deities also, they seem to be some kind of a Shiva, surely one would believe that is isolated or reclusive in nature. So the question about when we talk about, one part is about the reclusiveness, and second part is about closing the eyes or opening the eyes. So when we look at Shiva, often sometimes we do see the eyes are closed. Is this?
Well, Shiva is, they say he has the Tandava and he has the Lasya, both. Tandava is perhaps the aggressive part of expression, and Lasya is the delicate part of it. Uddanda Tandavam Udanchita Lasya Leelam, as they call it. So in that, Shiva gets involved and therefore he closes his eyes. And they say that he has a third eye. if he opens that, then the world will be destroyed. Or the whosoever is in front of him will be no more. So therefore, the third eye is not shown, and he is involved in his dance, in his dhyan, his meditation.
That's closed eyes.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's closing the eyes is looking inwards more.
Exactly. So this tradition where you are referred to as, I mean, in the Gharanas, it's the tradition. I mean, the practice of closing eyes is not encouraged in a way.
No, it's in the traditional setting. It is not encouraged. It was not encouraged for me because I learned from a very traditional guru.
Okay.
He taught me the authentic tradition in a traditional way, which I had to get away from it slowly, and then I got my own identity. I could understand that. But as I said, I think Ashokji also referred to Amir Khan Sahab, who used to close his eyes. And there are many after that who would close the eyes to sing. Even I was singing the second song, I was closing my eyes. And it's a natural response to one's own music. ठीक चल रहा है कि नहीं, एक कुछ देखने की जरूरत पड़ती है, उसके भी कारण होता होगा. And then one wants to really be oneself, by oneself. But Shiva is also a symbol of creativity, I felt. And in the traditional bandishis, he is more worshipped. But I also composed a bandish on Shiva because I took him as a symbol of creativity. And he also remains with the tribals. He is there everywhere. He is there in the Fiji Islands. The first port of embarkation is Nandi. They call it Nandi, but it is Nandi. Naithomba. It's a folk name of Shiva, maybe. And Shiva is there in many places. Khandoba. In Maharashtra, we have Khandoba. Vithoba is different. Khandoba is different. So,
another story about Shiva that relates to the Natya Shastra. It is said that after Bharat has completed the Natya Shastra, before it could be launched, it has to be approved by Shiva. So he went to Shiva. Shiva looked into it in whatever way. And then he said, add Tandu into it. Now the word Tanda, which became synonymous with ferocious masculine dance, was not the original meaning. He said, add Tanda to it. Now there was some Tandu whose reference is made and fragments are found, but no manuscript was ever discovered. So this Tanda is the abstract dance, non-narrative, which later in the terminology of dance became Nritta, pure dance, non-narrative. Now, Bharat was in a quandary because drama is born out of human action. There has to be a story out of which the rasa would be created. Now, how can pure dance, which has no story, no nothing, how does he put it there? And how does he justify it? So, but it is Shivagya, so it cannot be, it cannot disobey. So, Bharat Muni being Bharat Muni, all Munis have been very clever. So he decided to call it Shobha. He added Tanda and called it Shobha. Its purpose is pure dance, unrelated. That, you might say, is the beginning of abstraction in Natya. This is a story which, of course, is interesting, that what happens. And Tandav assumed this other meaning much later. Sometimes we forget that, for instance, we all believe that the word Adhunik, which is for the modern, came from the West. In fact, in the 10th century, there was in Darbhanga, in Nayai, Udayanacharya, he wanted to distinguish himself from the Kashmir Shaiva Nyaya tradition. He says, Te Prachina, Vayam Adhunika. So in recorded history, the word Adhunik is being used for the first time in the 10th century, not in the 19th century when it became current for the modern. This is part of that, those regions which we have seem to have sort of forgotten. And pure dance is a form of abstraction, because there you are not telling a story at all. There is no abhinay in the sense in which you have abhinay when you do the narrative pieces. Although in nritya there is abhinay. Tal itself can express, various kinds of tals can express human emotion without making a narrative state. So abstraction sort of includes in all kinds of forms.
If we have a little time, I would like Mukhtar to show us how a teen tal with 16 beats, it assumes different character and it has different waves when it is played along with a bandish. The simple teen tal is Now play the Siddharthani or Adha. That is dha, dhin, dha, dha. Then equi, dha, dhin, dha, dhin. It drops the third beat in all the divisions. Then there is Punjabi. The thing is, there is something in the tal which is measurable. But the last bit that she played, you can't count that. You just have to develop a sense for it and sing along with it. These are waves created. But there is sense in it.
There is a lot of sense in Punjab. Well, friends, with that we come to the end of this meandering, delightfully chaotic, but engaging conversation about abstraction. We hope that soon we would have occasion to invite you for another session of Art Matters as and when it comes about. You see, our times are times when rumors have to be spread, because nobody talks simply these days, and rumors have become somehow more trustworthy and more popular than. So please spread the rumors that there is Art Matters now in Bombay, and this is a rumor in which you are not going to hurt anybody, unlike the other rumors. This will be a good rumor, and and ask more people to come in, and we will think of more sessions depending on your response. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Raza Foundation, I express my gratitude to Piramal Foundation. Yesterday, I will just tell you 2 minutes, I was in Mandla for 4 days. Mandla is a place where Raza was born and is buried. And yesterday was his death anniversary, the second one. And we did a whole 4-day thing trying to tell Mandla, because Mandla knows nothing about Raza, as some of you know nothing about Tal, or perhaps not in all that detail. So it was to see the citizenry of Mandla becoming aware that a person who was born in a forest village is one of those villages which are not recorded in the revenue records. It's a shifting village. So he was born in a forest village with 9 hutments in one of the hutments. And he is now buried there. And one of the interesting things which I want to tell you, which you might have not heard of, he saw Mahatma Gandhi, at the age of 8. Even now going to Mandla is difficult. Imagine, in 1930, Mahatma Gandhi traveling to Mandla. So he went as an 8-year-old boy. Gandhiji, as you know, was not a good speaker. The real speakers were Nehru and Maulana Azad and such like. Gandhi used to budbudate the, to bahut अच्छे speaker to the. So he didn't understand what did he say, whatever. But it made a deep impression on him. Now, his family, entire family left for Pakistan. 3 brothers, 1 sister, his first wife, all left for Pakistan. He did not go. And whenever somebody will ask him, कि आप क्यों नहीं गए? Because हमारा वतन है, हम छोड़ के कहाँ जाएंगे? हमको क्या करना पाकिस्तान से? So once I probed him a little deeper. And then he said, look, Ashok, I never tell this. This is not something which I should tell. I saw Gandhiji at the age of 8 in Mandla. And it made such an impression on me that when this 47, partition came, I thought if I go, like my family is going and they're putting pressure, I will be betraying that man whom I saw in Mandla. So you see how things move and where people get, and it is therefore all of a piece that he is buried in Mandla. And I can tell you, dying in this country is very, very complicated affair. We didn't realize this until he died. He died, then I rang up Mandla to say that we are coming there. The collectors are the new illiterates. No? So he's an IS officer, and she had not heard of Raza and not heard of anything anyway. So I said, okay, we don't have to do anything. We are just coming. I wanted to tell you this. Now, to take the body from the hospital, it takes 4 hours to get the damn thing. Then we realized that you cannot take it on a plane unless it is embalmed. Embalming cannot be done in every hospital. It was not done in Max Saket. It has to be done in AIMS. It was a Saturday. The doctor had left. So we sort of had to do a bit of calling some MP, getting that. The body was delivered to us at 1 o'clock embalmed. It had to be given to the cargo counter 4 hours before the flight. The flight is at 6 o'clock in the morning. The flight to Jabalpur cannot take that coffin because it's a small plane. So it had to come to Nagpur. And from Nagpur we went. My dear, when you are planning to die in a more systematic way. Provide for these things. Donate your body and things of that kind. That is much better. And then the death certificate. Oh my God. It's a very, very, and I say it as an ex-civil servant, that our lives have been made hell by politicians, by bureaucrats and by contractors, especially the builders. Thank you very much. Art matters, but these things impinge on art.
Yes, I think Begum Akhtar also died in Ahmedabad, and her body was for other reasons. Nobody could carry it. And then she had to be tied, the body had to be tied on a truck up on that, and then she was brought. So it's, hmm.
I told my chief minister, why state honors are given only to politicians? Why not to a great musician like him? He said, yes, yes. So he was, but what did the commissioner do? He took a truck and put the body into the truck. So I had to issue detailed instructions how to do it later. When Kumar Gandhar died, I had already been kicked out, but the government followed. This government also was forced during Raza's time, but they did it in a very shabby manner because they never knew how to turn your thing and do the salute and this, that, and that. But hopefully we'll all die without knowing about it.